Okay, so he had more than 20 years on the force with not a mark against him. Before last year, a sergeant with the St. Louis County Police had only ever been written up for a disciplinary infraction once in his entire career. And that was because he had once forgotten his badge. When he showed up for work, he had misplaced his badge, and so he got in trouble for that. That had been the only time he'd been written up or had any mark against him. More than 20 years on the force. But then, last year, in quick succession, that same sergeant got reprimanded and dinged and punished over and over and over again. His lieutenant wrote him up for failure to supervise, saying he should have gone to the scene of an incident to supervise officers who were under his command. A few weeks later, the same sergeant was written up again, this time for allegedly entering incorrect codes on some payroll documents. Then they sprung an impromptu drug test on him with no warning, telling him he was being drug tested that very day, had to take it within 2 hours. Then they revoked his access to the police-issue vehicle that he'd been given to be his take-home car on the police force. When they revoked his take-home car, 2 other sergeants from the police department showed up at his house to take the car away from him, and he says, to stand over him with their hands on their pistols as they watched him clean the vehicle out with his hands. Then after that, the county decided that this sergeant should be transferred away from the district where he worked, which was right near to where he lived. They moved him to a district farther away from where he lived, with no explanation. And that transfer away from his home district, that, the sergeant says, was the last straw. And he filed a complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, saying the reason he believed he was suddenly being treated this way after 20 spotless years on the force was because he was a whistleblower. Because he was the whistleblower who had previously only been known by the name Lone Wolf. For months, someone signing the name Lone Wolf had written a series of anonymous letters to the St. Louis County Police chief. The letters started in December 2012, and they said that a powerful and well-connected lieutenant in that police department had been directing uniformed St. Louis County police officers that they should specifically arrest black people, that they should specifically target black people for arrest in specific shopping areas in southern St. Louis County. Lone Wolf, this whistleblower, said that this lieutenant would make these claims out in the open at roll call. With the other officers present, the lieutenant would say things like, quote, let's have a black day. Let's today stop everybody with a tan. Let's stop everybody black at the mall. Quote, let's make the jail cells more colorful. According to Lone Wolf, this whistleblower, among the uniformed officers who were being told this by their lieutenant at the start of their shifts at roll call, there were some black officers. Lone Wolf says the lieutenant dealt with that awkwardness by telling those black officers, don't worry, I don't mean you guys, you're the good ones. Lone Wolf, the sergeant who was the whistleblower, later told the St. Louis Post-Dispatch that he had waited months before summoning the courage to write those anonymous letters about the behavior of his lieutenant, because he said this lieutenant had often bragged about being really well connected, about knowing all the top commanders in the department. The whistleblower told the paper, quote, I had no intention to take the police department down. But these things had to be stopped. When a black person can't go shopping at a mall, it's wrong. This isn't 50 years ago. Both the sergeant who was the whistleblower and the lieutenant who he was whistleblowing against, incidentally, were both white men. The allegations by the whistleblower triggered an internal review in St. Louis County. The lieutenant denied all the allegations, but 2 things happened in the course of that review. First thing, Lone Wolf, the whistleblower, when he came forward and talked to internal affairs, so inside the police department, they knew who had previously been anonymous. They knew who had been the whistleblower. That, he said, is when this chain of retaliation started against him. Losing his take-home car, getting drug tested, getting transferred far away from his house, getting those demerits essentially in his personnel file, all the rest of it. He says that started as soon as he identified himself to internal affairs. Internal retaliation for blowing the whistle on another cop. But the investigation did happen, though. And that investigation did give other officers on the force a chance to corroborate these allegations. And sure enough, by the time the county police chief fired that lieutenant in St. Louis County, It was because that police chief, through the internal affairs investigation, was able to find not one, not two, but at least 9 other officers who said, yeah, that stuff that the guy was alleging, that actually did happen. The letter from the county police chief to the lieutenant ultimately firing him, that letter was leaked to the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. It said in part, quote, "You were heard by at least 9 officers on multiple occasions directing enforcement actions on persons with black, tan, or colored skin without any reference to probable cause." So that police lieutenant in St. Louis County last year was fired for what was described as his racial remarks. He did lose his job. Apparently, that came at great cost to the man who blew the whistle on his racist behavior. After the lieutenant was fired, the police chief in St. Louis County also announced that he would also ask for new data about race and policing in St. Louis County. He said he would contact a team of researchers at UCLA in California to come in and study the St. Louis County arrest data to ensure that racial profiling wasn't occurring, to ensure basically that police officers under this lieutenant's command weren't actually following his instructions to go fill up the jail cells that day with black people. It's interesting, though, getting more data about that sort of thing, getting more data about the risk that black people and white people are being policed differently. I mean, it never seems like a bad idea to have more information about something like that. But Missouri, interestingly, already does have a ton of information on that subject publicly available if anybody cares to look. It's no secret. And there's an interesting reason why. In the year 2000, the Missouri legislature had a particularly bad year. It was described as a caustic legislative session in 2000 in the great state of Missouri. But one of the things they did pass by overwhelming margins in both the House and the Senate that year in Missouri was a bill about racial profiling, a bill specifically to collect data on race and policing. In August 2000, the then Democratic Governor Mel Carnahan and the then Attorney General, who's now the Democratic Governor of Missouri, Jay Nixon, they were both personally on hand for the public signing of this Missouri bill that, A, banned racial profiling by police in Missouri, but B, it also required that every police officer in the state would have to record information about the race of the person they were stopping every time they made a traffic stop. They have to do that in the state of Missouri by law since the year 2000. Every police department and every police officer in the state, it's mandatory reporting. And so there's this incredible data, incredible arrest by arrest data made publicly available on the website of the Missouri Attorney General's office every year. And it's well laid out. You just click on the county, click on the town within the county, click on it year by year, and it tells you exactly what proportion of people stopped in every little town across the state are black, white, Hispanic, Asian, Native American, or other. And so in, say, the town of Ferguson, Missouri, which is in St. Louis County, you can get very specific data for each of the last 14 years about your racial likelihood of getting stopped by police for some reason in that particular town. And in that data, you can see over time remarkable consistency for the racial ratio of how people who live in that town are policed. I mean, this is official data from the state of Missouri. It's not some outside survey. It's not something that somebody comes in and does once every 6 years and hopes it's a snapshot. It's year by year by year, arrest after arrest after arrest, every town in the state by law. And it comes up with an incredibly comprehensive and detailed racial disparity index for policing, town by town. This is basically what they found for Ferguson. If there was no racial inflection at all to the rate at which people got stopped, if a racial group's proportion of the population was exactly the same as the proportion of stops by the police for that group, then that ratio would be 1.0. That would be totally neutral. So you see that marked with a gray line there. Here's what that ratio actually is for black people in Ferguson. See how much above 1.0 it is? That's how much more likely black people are to get stopped by police relative to their share of the population in Ferguson, Missouri. This is what it is for white people. Oh, look how far below that line it is. That's how much less likely you are to get stopped by police in Ferguson relative to white people's share of the population in that town. If you want to look at it another way, the most recent data for 2013, black people made up 67% of the population in Ferguson, but they made up 86% of the traffic stops. And that is a big disparity, just as a snapshot in time for a single year in a single town. But what is actually more amazing is how long it has consistently been like that in that town. And in towns across Missouri, frankly, but in that town specifically. I mean, that disparity in terms of how much more often black people are stopped by police in Ferguson, Missouri, is no secret. It's not spiking any one way or another. This is pretty much what it is. And the data about that proves it and shows it has been publicly available data since back in 2000. We've had 14 years of knowing it's this way. When Mel Carnahan signed that law requiring this data to be collected and to be made publicly available, he said this at the time. He said, the statistical evidence that will be created will be objective evidence to the public as to the prevalence of this problem. And it is, right? It is. We have objective evidence as to the prevalence of this problem and the fact that it's never changing. It turns out sunlight itself doesn't actually disinfect anything. Knowing that the problem exists, publishing state data about the existence and persistence of the problem has done nothing itself to make the problem go away. We're not so ashamed when we look at those numbers that we do anything to change it. When St. Louis County had to fire a supervising lieutenant for telling uniformed officers at roll call at the start of their shifts that they should go out that day and make sure to arrest lots of black people, part of the response, in addition to firing that officer, was to say, let's get more data on this problem. Well, yeah, the data is very helpful to have in order to talk about what the problem is so we can all agree on what the problem is. But having the data itself apparently does not fix anything. It doesn't happen statewide, didn't happen specifically in St. Louis County. Having the data, knowing the problem exists, isn't enough to get rid of the problem. And apparently, public protest and unflattering attention aren't enough to get rid of the problem either. I mean, it was a hullabaloo in St. Louis County when they had to fire the let's have a black day police lieutenant, right? But still, 6 months later, the NAACP in Missouri was filing a new federal civil rights complaint against the same police department, alleging further instances of racial disparity, including the way they were disciplining their own officers. The Justice Department also has an ongoing investigation into racial disparities in another part of justice in St. Louis County. They have an ongoing investigation into how St. Louis County provides legal representation to juveniles in the court system. In Ferguson, which again is 2/3 black, 67% black, there's no black member of the school board. There were protests last year when that school board, with no black people on it, decided to suspend the superintendent of schools in Ferguson, who does happen to be African American. The community where 18-year-old Michael Brown was shot and killed by a police officer this weekend has a population that is 2/3 black. Of its 53 police officers, 3 of them are black. 2 black women and 1 black man out of 53 officers. And knowing that and fixing that are not the same thing. Knowing that, having complete data that everybody agrees is the truth about that, apparently is not enough of an incentive for us to fix it. And that, though, is the inescapable context for the outrage over this young man's death in Missouri this weekend. And one protester told the New York Times this today: you have to begin with the frustration. Treatment of these communities is not equal. In white communities, the police truly protect and serve. In black communities, that is not the case. Part of the policing complaint here in Ferguson is obviously whatever led this unarmed 18-year-old boy, whose family's attorney says he was wearing shorts and a tank top and flip-flops at the time, what led him to be shot multiple times by a police officer in broad daylight. That's part of the problem, obviously. But another part of it is how the police have responded to the protests that have erupted after that killing. And police have told local journalists turning up to cover the protests that they've said flat out to journalists showing up to cover them, you are entering a war zone. You guys are in the middle of a war zone. And it looks like a war zone. Police presence in the street at times has looked like a cross between a SWAT raid and a full-scale military invasion. One CNN crew was filming behind those militarized front lines on Sunday night in Ferguson, and behind those lines, out of SWAT gear, he caught one police officer screaming at the protesters, "Bring it, all you effing animals, bring it."
Racial tensions and nerves on edge. Even an officer we caught on camera gave in to his rage, calling protesters animals. Listen.
Bring it. Bring it.
The Ferguson Police Department had said yesterday that they today would release the name of the officer who was involved in this shooting. Today, they did say that that officer is on administrative leave, but that they have decided not to release his name. They say there have been threats against him, and so they've decided not to release it. The St. Louis County Police Department today did release preliminary results of an autopsy on 18-year-old Michael Brown. The autopsy reportedly shows that Michael Brown died of gunshot wounds, but police will not yet say how many gunshot wounds. They have said in the past that they believe there were multiple shots fired, and they believe that no weapon was involved other than the officer's weapon, which killed him. President Obama released a statement this afternoon saying this: "The death of Michael Brown is heartbreaking, and Michelle and I send our deepest condolences to his family and his community at this very difficult time. I know the events of the past few days have prompted strong passions, but as details unfold, I urge everyone in Ferguson, Missouri, and across the country to remember this young man through reflection and understanding. We should comfort each other and talk with one another in a way that heals, not in a way that wounds. Along with our prayers, that's what Michael and his family and our broader American community deserve." In St. Louis County today, Michael Brown's family continued to call for justice in this case and a full investigation. They've also continued to call for calm and to denounce anybody who has rioted or looted, as the protests have sometimes descended into anger and chaos. In his role as president of the National Action Network, MSNBC's Al Sharpton spoke with the family today, spent the day with the family today, and then publicly called for calm, saying that that was the right way to honor this young man.
This is not a cause for them. This is their child. This is not some prop for politics. This is their child. No one has the right to take their child's name and drag it through the mud because you're angry. To become violent in Michael Brown's name is to betray the gentle giant that he was. Don't be so angry. Don't be so angry that you distort the image of who his mother and father told us he was. Some of us are making the story how mad we are rather than how promising he was. Don't be a traitor to Michael Brown in the name of you man. Please put justice and Michael as the priority. I know you're angry. I know that this is outrageous. When I saw that picture, it rose up in me an outrage. But we can't be more outraged than his mom and his daddy. That's right. We are not more angry than his mom and daddy. And if they can hold their heads with dignity, then we can hold our heads with dignity. There are those that are saying peace, but they really just mean quiet. Because in order to establish peace, you must have fair justice for everyone. We want real peace. We don't want to just be told to shut up and suffer in silence. We must have answers and then use those answers to guide us toward peace.
Reverend Al Sharpton with the National Action Network calling for calm but not for silence. He and the family and local leaders called for another demonstration this evening, which started within the past hour. Local leaders and the family are calling for a day of fasting and prayer tomorrow. They're also asking people who may have witnessed the shooting or who may have information about it to come forward, particularly anybody who has photo or video evidence of what happened. And this is kind of amazing. They're also asking for the people who have already identified themselves as eyewitnesses to the shooting to be allowed to speak to the police. Think about that for a second. This is one of the more remarkable and as yet unexplained things that has happened thus far in this case. This is the young man who was walking with Michael Brown when this altercation with a police officer of whatever kind resulted in Mike Brown being shot and killed in the street. This young man was the guy he was with. This young man was there in the moment that this happened. He was the third person on the scene. He was the third person between the person who was shot and the person who shot him. This young man made himself known publicly immediately after the incident happened. He did multiple interviews. He talked to the Canadian Broadcast Corporation. He talked to the CBS affiliate, KMOV in St. Louis. He spoke with MSNBC.com. He did this interview last night with Chris Hayes here on MSNBC on All In. And he told his story about what he saw. He's told his story in a remarkably consistent way across all of these different interviews about what happened. He's told it again over and over and over again to all of these different media outlets. But that young man has not yet talked to the police. The local NAACP said today that they contacted the local police on this young man's behalf to ask if he could please give them a formal statement as they investigate this matter. That young man has not talked to them yet. He has not yet talked to anybody who is formally investigating this matter. So, yeah, there is a lot of anger about this killing. And there's a lot of long-standing reason to be angry about racial disparity in law enforcement in Missouri and in this county in Missouri and in this town in Missouri. But since this happened this weekend, it's only Tuesday, one of the unfathomable things about this investigation is that whatever official investigation or investigations of this shooting are supposedly underway, they so far have not involved anyone official talking to the other person who was there at the scene. It's bewildering. Late tonight, that young man's attorney, he has now secured an attorney, said that both the St. Louis County prosecutor and the FBI have now been in touch to schedule interviews. But as of yet, he has not spoken to them.